theory. Actual practices that shift how your mind relates to every physical change happening right now. The Buddha taught that aging becomes suffering only when we resist what is already unfolding. When we stop resisting, something remarkable happens. The fear dissolves. The anxiety quiets. What remains is peace with exactly what is. These 7 stories come from the oldest Buddhist texts, the Pali Canon, the Therigatha, authentic records preserved for over 2,000 years. Each one shows a different person discovering this same truth. An elderly couple learning their minds need not age with their bodies. A woman whose famous beauty faded completely, yet found something far more valuable. A father and daughter who faced death itself with such presence that even their final moments became teachings. By the time you reach the end of this journey, your relationship with your changing body will have shifted. Not because anything external changed, because you remembered something you already know, but have forgotten. Let the world outside continue. Here, we have 3 hours to remember together what the Buddha taught about growing older with wisdom instead of fear. In a small village near the city of Sumsumaragiri, there lived an elderly couple who had grown old together. Their names were Nakulapita and Nakulamata, and by the time this story takes place, they had already spent decades as devoted followers of the Buddha's teachings. But devotion to the teachings and freedom from suffering are not always the same thing. Nakulapita had reached that stage of life when the body makes itself known in ways it never did before. His joints ached when he rose in the morning. His back protested when he sat too long. Simple tasks that used to take moments now required careful planning and rest. Some days were better than others, but increasingly, the difficult days outnumbered the easy ones. What troubled him most was not the physical discomfort itself, but the cascade of fears that accompanied each new limitation. When he couldn't lift something he used to carry easily, he worried about becoming a burden. When illness kept him in bed, he feared he might not recover. When he looked at his wife, he wondered what would happen to her if he died first. Beneath all these specific fears lay a deeper anxiety, the feeling that his very self was dissolving along with his body's strength. His wife Nakulamata was also aging, also experiencing her own physical changes, but somehow she carried it differently. She moved through her days with a quality of acceptance that puzzled him. Not resignation, not giving up, something else entirely. A kind of peace he couldn't quite access. One morning, after a particularly difficult night of pain and sleeplessness, Nakulapita made a decision. The Buddha was staying nearby at a grove called Besakala, and Nakulapita decided he needed to speak with him directly. His wife accompanied him on the journey, which took longer than it would have years before, with more rest stops and careful attention to each step. When they finally reached the grove, Nakulapita felt a mixture of relief and embarrassment. Here he was, an old man complaining about old age to someone who surely had more important matters to address. But the Buddha's face showed only warmth and genuine interest as they approached and offered their respects. Nakulapita sat down heavily, his body grateful for the rest. For a moment he wasn't sure how to begin, but then the words simply came. "Venerable Sir, I am old now. My body is aged, burdened with years, advanced in life, come to the last stage. I am afflicted in body and often ill. It is only rarely that I get to see you, and I fear I may not have many more opportunities." He paused, gathering courage. "I am afraid, teacher, not just of death itself, but of what my decline means for those I love. My wife is also growing older. If something happens to me, how will she manage? And I feel like I'm watching myself disappear, piece by piece, as my body fails." The Buddha looked at him with such compassion that Nakulapita felt tears spring to his eyes. But the Buddha's next words were not what he expected. Not sympathy, not platitudes, but something far more practical. "Nakulapita, this body of yours is indeed afflicted, sick, burdened. Whoever would claim this body is healthy, even for a moment, displays nothing but foolishness. The body will age. The body will sicken. The body will eventually cease. This is its nature, and no amount of wishing will change this fundamental truth." Nakulapita felt his heart sink. This was exactly what he feared. Confirmation that his worst anxieties were justified. But the Buddha wasn't finished. However, the Buddha continued, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Though your body is afflicted, you should train yourself so that your mind is not afflicted along with it. The body will age. This is beyond your control. But the mind need not age in the same way. The body will experience pain. This is inevitable. But suffering is something else entirely, and suffering is not inevitable at all." Something shifted in the space between them. Nakulapita leaned forward, sensing he was about to hear something essential. His wife Nakulamata, sitting quietly beside him, seemed to already understand, nodding slightly as if recognizing something she had discovered on her own. The Buddha looked directly at Nakulapita with piercing kindness. "Tell me, when your knee aches, is that ache your mind or your knee?" "My knee, Venerable Sir," Nakulapita answered immediately. "And when your back is stiff, is that stiffness your awareness or your spine?" "My spine, teacher." "And when you feel pain in your body, where is the pain felt?" Nakulapita paused, suddenly uncertain. "In my body, Venerable Sir, but I am also aware of the pain. So, is the pain in my body or in my awareness? The Buddha smiled. This is the beginning of wisdom. The body experiences its conditions: age, sickness, pain, weakness. The mind knows these conditions, but the mind that knows pain is not itself in pain. The awareness that observes aging is not itself aging. The consciousness that watches the body's decline does not itself decline. He let this settle before continuing. You have spent your whole life identifying completely with this body. When the body was strong, you thought, I am strong. When the body was healthy, you thought, I am healthy. Now that the body weakens, you naturally think, I am weak. I am failing. But what if all of these thoughts are based on a fundamental misunderstanding? Nakulapita felt something loosening in his chest, like a knot beginning to untie. What misunderstanding, Venerable Sir? The misunderstanding that you are this body. Consider this carefully. The body you had as a child is completely different from the body you have now. Every cell has been replaced many times over. Which of these bodies is you? Or are you something that has been aware of all these changes without itself changing? The grove seemed extraordinarily quiet. Even the birds had fallen silent. Nakulamata reached over and gently touched her husband's hand, and he realized she had tears running down her weathered cheeks, not tears of sadness, but recognition, relief. The Buddha continued, his voice gentle but unwavering. The body is not yours to keep. It never was. It is made of borrowed elements: earth, water, fire, air, that will return to their sources. It arises due to conditions, exists for a time, and ceases when conditions change. To grasp at it, to identify with it, to think, this is me, this is mine, this is myself, this is the root of your suffering. But Venerable Sir, Nakulapita asked, his voice trembling, if I'm not this body, then what am I? When the body dies, what remains? The Buddha's eyes were infinitely kind. You are asking the wrong question. The question is not, what am I? But rather, is there any fixed, permanent thing that can truly be called I? Look at your experience right now. Your body changes. Your feelings change from pleasant to unpleasant to neutral. Your perceptions change. Depending on what you're experiencing, your thoughts arise and pass away like clouds. Where in all of this is there anything permanent enough to be called a fixed self? Nakulapita sat very still, looking inward at his actual experience, rather than his ideas about it. The Buddha was right. Everything he could observe was in flux. His breathing changed from moment to moment. Sensations arose and passed. Thoughts came and went. Even the sense of being someone aging and worried was just another thought that appeared and disappeared. But if there's no permanent self, Nakulapita said slowly, then what am I afraid of losing? What is it that fears death? Exactly, the Buddha said warmly. When you look closely at this fear, what do you find? Not a solid, permanent I that is threatened, but rather a habit of mind, a pattern of clinging that has been running for so long it feels real. But habits can be seen through, and what is seen clearly loses its power to cause suffering. He leaned forward slightly. Here is what you should practice, Nakulapita. When your body experiences pain, notice it clearly without adding the thought, I am in pain. Simply observe. There is pain in the body. When your body feels weak, notice it without concluding, I am weak. Simply observe. There is weakness in the body. Create this small space between what the body experiences and how you interpret it. At first, this will feel strange, unnatural even, but gradually, as you practice this awareness, something remarkable will happen. The body will continue aging, but the mind will discover a peace that doesn't depend on the body's condition. The body will experience pain, but the mind will not be tormented by it. The body will eventually die, but the mind will meet that death without terror. Nakulamata spoke for the first time, her voice clear and steady. Venerable Sir, I have been practicing something similar without knowing quite what I was doing. When I notice my husband worrying about what will happen to me, I try to remind him that I am not as fragile as he fears. I too am aging, but I can still work with my hands, still think clearly, still care for myself. His worry comes from love, but also from not seeing clearly. The Buddha nodded with appreciation. This is wisdom, Nakulamata. You see that your husband's worry is not truly protecting you. It is only creating suffering in his mind. This clear seeing is exactly what I'm teaching. He turned back to Nakulapita. Your wife is showing you something important. Your worry about her is based on an image in your mind, but that image is not reality. Meanwhile, the real person sitting beside you has her own strength, her own clarity, her own capacity to meet whatever comes. Nakulapita looked at his wife with fresh eyes. She smiled at him, and he saw something he'd somehow missed. Yes, she was old, her hair white, her face lined with years, but there was a brightness in her eyes, a groundedness in her presence that spoke of someone who had already made peace with what he was still fighting. You have both been practitioners of the Dharma for many years, the Buddha said warmly. According to those who remember such things, you have been each other's parents and relations across many lifetimes. Now you have the opportunity to support each other in a new way, not by trying to prevent each other's suffering, which is impossible, but by helping each other see clearly the nature of suffering and the path beyond it. After the Buddha finished speaking, Nakulapita sat quietly, integrating what he'd heard. He noticed that his knee still ached. The teaching hadn't magically healed his body, but something had shifted in how he related to that ache. It was there, present, real, but somehow it didn't feel as heavy or threatening as before. Still, questions remained. How to actually practice this moment by moment? The Buddha seemed to sense this. What I've shared is the essence of the teaching, but you may benefit from speaking with one of my senior disciples. Sariputta is staying nearby, and he has great skill in explaining these subtleties. After thanking the Buddha with deep bows, Nakulapita and Nakulamata made their way to where Sariputta was sitting under a large tree. When the elder monk finished teaching a small group, Nakulapita approached and recounted his conversation. Sariputta listened with complete attention. When Nakulapita finished, he nodded slowly. The Blessed One has given you the teaching of how the body can be afflicted while the mind remains unafflicted. Let me help you understand this more completely. He gestured for them to sit closer. Consider the 5 aggregates that make up what we call a person: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Right now, you identify with all of these. When your body hurts, you say, "I hurt." When you feel sad, you say, "I am sad." This is the afflicted mind, one that has completely merged with these changing phenomena. But there is another way, Sariputta continued. You can learn to observe these aggregates without identifying with them. The body is experienced, but you recognize this body is not me, not mine, not myself. Feelings arise, but you recognize these feelings are not me, not mine, not myself. Nakulapita furrowed his brow. But Venerable Sir, isn't saying, "Not me, not mine," just another thought. How does that help? Sariputta smiled. You are quite right to question this. Yes, at first these are just words, but they point your attention toward investigation rather than assumption. When you say, "This body is not me," you're not making a new belief. You're actually looking to see if it's true. You're investigating your actual experience. He demonstrated with a gesture toward his own body. Right now, there is stiffness in this back. If I automatically think I am stiff, the mind contracts around that sensation. But if I notice there is stiffness, or there is the sensation called stiffness being known by awareness, something interesting happens. The sensation remains the same, but the mental suffering dissolves. Why? Because I've stopped taking it personally. Nakulamata leaned forward. This is what I've been doing without knowing the formal teaching. When my hands ache from working, I notice them as hands that ache, rather than as my aching hands. It's a subtle difference, but it changes everything. Precisely, Sariputta said. You've discovered through your own practice what the teaching describes. This is the difference between the afflicted body and the unafflicted mind. The body ages, sickens, experiences pain. These are its natural conditions. The mind, when it doesn't cling to the body as self, remains spacious, peaceful, unshaken. He looked at both of them with deep kindness. You have grown old in years, but you don't have to grow old in wisdom. In fact, these very challenges, the aching joints, the declining strength, the awareness of mortality, can become your greatest teachers if you meet them with clear awareness rather than resistance. Nakulapita felt something releasing in his chest. I think I'm beginning to understand. Not completely, but enough to start practicing differently. When the pain comes, I can try to notice it as simply pain rather than as my pain, as proof that I am falling apart. That is exactly right, Sariputta confirmed. Don't expect perfection. You've spent decades building the habit of identifying with the body. But each time you catch it, each time you create that small space between sensation and identification, you weaken the habit's grip. Over time, that space becomes more natural, more available, more reliable. As Nakulapita and Nakulamata walked slowly home together later that day, they moved with a different quality. The journey was no easier on their bodies, no less taxing, but something had fundamentally shifted. The pain was still there, but it wasn't a problem in the same way. The aging was still happening, but it wasn't a catastrophe. Nakulamata spoke quietly as they rested by the side of the road. All this time, I thought I was helping you by trying to reassure you that I would be fine. But what you really needed was what the Buddha offered, not reassurance about the future, but clear seeing about the present. Nakulapita took her hand, feeling the familiar texture of her skin, weathered by years of living. And I thought I was protecting you by worrying. But worry isn't protection. It's just suffering happening in advance of any actual problem. The Buddha showed me that aging doesn't have to mean the mind ages along with the body. They sat together in comfortable silence as the afternoon sun filtered through the trees. Both of them were still old. Both would continue to age. Eventually, both would die. None of these facts had changed, but their relationship to these facts had transformed completely, and that transformation made all the difference between suffering and peace. There was once a woman named Ambapali who lived in the city of Vesali, and for years, her name was spoken with a kind of reverence, usually reserved for royalty or religious figures. But Ambapali was neither queen nor saint, at least not at first. She was a courtesan, famous throughout the region for a beauty so striking that kings would compete for an evening in her presence. Her eyes, people said, were like polished jewels that caught the light. Her hair fell in waves of black so deep and glossy, it reminded observers of a bee's wing in sunlight. Her skin was flawless, her movements graceful, her voice like music. Men of wealth and power would travel great distances just to see her, and they paid extravagant sums for the privilege of her company. Ambapali herself was not naive about her circumstances. She understood that her beauty was both her fortune and her prison. The same qualities that brought her wealth and status were also impermanent. She knew this intellectually, even if she didn't yet understand it, in the deeper way she would come to know later. She saw other courtesans age and watched how quickly the crowds moved on to younger faces. But when you are young and beautiful, and the world revolves around you, it's easy to think your own situation might somehow be different. Then one day, the Buddha came to Vasali. Ambapali heard about this teacher who spoke of liberation, of freedom from suffering, of a path that had nothing to do with youth or beauty or wealth. Something in her stirred, a curiosity perhaps, or a longing she hadn't known was there. She arranged to meet him, expecting perhaps that he would be like other men who came to see her, dazzled by her appearance, eager for her attention. But when the Buddha looked at her, he didn't see a beautiful woman or a famous courtesan. He saw a person carrying the same fundamental suffering as everyone else, trapped in the same cycles of grasping and aversion, capable of the same profound awakening. His gaze was neither attracted nor repelled. It was simply clear, seeing her as she actually was, rather than as an image or an object. That clarity shook something loose in Ambapali. For the first time in years, perhaps in her entire life, she felt truly seen, not as a body to be desired, not as a possession to be acquired, but as a being with the potential for complete freedom. The Buddha taught her about the nature of all conditioned things, how everything that arises must also pass away. He taught her about the body and how identifying with it creates endless suffering. He taught her that clinging to what cannot be kept is the root of all unhappiness. And most importantly, he taught her that liberation was possible, that freedom from this cycle of clinging and suffering was available to anyone willing to walk the path. Ambapali listened with her entire being. The teachings landed in her heart with the force of recognition, not as new information, but as a truth she had somehow always known, but never articulated. Within days, she made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. She gave away her considerable wealth, donated her famous mango grove to the Buddhist community, and asked to be ordained as a nun. The transformation was immediate and total. The elaborate hairstyles were replaced by a shaved head. The luxurious silks gave way to simple robes. The woman who had been adorned and decorated and displayed became someone who owned nothing but a bowl and the clothes on her back. And in that simplicity, she found a peace she had never known amid all the luxury. But becoming a nun was just the beginning. The real work was internal, learning to see clearly, to observe without grasping, to let go of the deeply ingrained habits of self-identification. Ambapali practiced meditation with the same intensity she had once applied to perfecting her appearance. She studied the teachings, sat in silence, and gradually began to experience directly what the Buddha had described. Years passed, then decades, and as they did, Something began happening to Amberpali's body that would have once filled her with horror. She was aging. The hair that had been compared to a bee's wing began to grey, then turned completely white, coarse, like hemp fibre. The eyes that had sparkled like jewels grew dim. The skin that had been so smooth and flawless began to wrinkle and sag. The body that kings had competed to possess became bent and frail. The breasts that had been full and firm now hanging loose. The limbs that had moved with such grace now stiff and uncertain. But here is what's remarkable. Amberpali watched all of this happen with neither grief nor fear. She didn't lament the loss of her beauty or rage against the changes in her body. Instead, she saw her aging as a profound teaching unfolding in real time, her own body becoming a demonstration of what the Buddha had taught about the impermanent nature of all things. By this time, Amberpali had achieved what in Buddhism is called full awakening, complete liberation from suffering, the end of all grasping and delusion. From this place of freedom, she began to compose verses, describing her transformation, not as poetry meant to impress, but as precise observations of truth, as teachings that could help others see what she had seen. She would sit in meditation, examining her aging body with the same clarity she had learned to apply to her mind, and the verses would arise naturally, each one following the same pattern, a memory of how things were, an observation of how things are now, and the recognition that this change is exactly what the Buddha taught about. Her verses began with her hair. She remembered how it had once been fragrant and black, glossy as a bee's wing, how people would comment on its beauty, how much care she had devoted to maintaining it. Now it was grey and coarse, like hemp, brittle and thin. "Not otherwise is the word of the truthful one," she would say at the end of each verse. Meaning, this change is exactly what the Buddha taught would happen, and it has happened just as he said. She described her forehead, once smooth as a polished bowl, now creased with wrinkles. Her eyebrows, once like crescents, carefully drawn, now scraggly and drooping. Her eyes, which had been compared to the petals of a blue lotus, bright and flashing, now dull and weak, their beauty completely gone. She spoke of her ears, once adorned with beautiful rings and ornaments, now drooping. Her nose, once delicate and lovely, now wrinkled like a withered fruit. Her teeth, which had gleamed like jasmine buds, now broken and discolored. Her voice, once sweet as a cuckoo's song in the forest, now cracked and faltering. She described her neck, once smooth and unlined, now bent and creased. Her arms, which had been like rounded gold, now weak as the wood of a withered tree. Her hands, which had been so graceful, now trembling and covered with veins. Her breasts, once full and firm and uplifted, now hanging loose like empty water bags. She spoke of her body which had been smooth and golden, like a sheet of gold, now covered with fine wrinkles, like those on an old elephant's skin. Her thighs, which had been like an elephant's trunk, now thin and weak. Her calves, once shapely and smooth, now shrunken. Her feet, which had been adorned with rings and had stepped so gracefully, now swollen and cracked. And after each detailed, unflinching observation, she would repeat the same refrain: "This is exactly what the Buddha taught. This body is subject to change. Everything that comes together must come apart. All that is beautiful must decay. Nothing can be held on to. This is not a tragedy. This is simply the nature of all conditioned things." What makes Ambapali's verses so extraordinary is not just their honesty, but the complete absence of complaint in them. She wasn't mourning her lost beauty. She wasn't bitter about aging. She wasn't trying to cling to the past or deny the present. She was simply observing, clearly and precisely, what was happening and recognizing it as the truth she had been taught and had come to understand completely. For Ambapali, the aging of her body was not an obstacle to her spiritual practice. It was the practice itself. Every wrinkle was a teaching on impermanence. Every grey hair was a reminder not to grasp at what cannot be kept. Every change in her physical form was proof of what the Buddha had taught about the nature of all things. This is a radically different approach to aging than what most of us take. Usually, we relate to aging as a problem to be solved, or at least postponed. We use creams and treatments. We dye our hair. We do whatever we can to maintain the appearance of youth. And there's nothing inherently wrong with taking care of our bodies. But Ambapali was pointing to something deeper. She was showing that the body can be a gateway to liberation rather than a trap. By observing its changes clearly, without adding stories about what those changes mean about our worth or our future, we can see directly into the nature of reality itself. The body becomes a teacher, and aging becomes a continuous lesson in letting go. Consider what Ambapali was actually doing with these verses. She was taking what most people experience as a source of suffering, the loss of youth and beauty, and transforming it into medicine. Not by denying the changes or pretending they didn't matter, but by seeing them so clearly that their impermanent nature became obvious and undeniable. She had spent the first part of her life building an identity around her beauty. That beauty had brought her wealth, fame, and the attention of powerful men. It had also brought her suffering, because she was trapped by it, defined by it, limited by it. When she became a nun and began practicing the Buddha's teachings, she started to loosen her grip on that identity. And now, in old age, she was watching that identity dissolve completely as her body changed in ways that made her previous beauty unrecognizable. But here's what's crucial to understand. Ambapali didn't lose herself when she lost her beauty. she discovered that there had never been a fixed self to lose in the first place. The beauty had been temporary, yes, but so was everything else. Her thoughts, her feelings, her perceptions, even her sense of being a separate someone who was aging. All of it was in constant flux, arising and passing, moment by moment. This is what the Buddha taught as the three characteristics of all conditioned existence: impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and not self. Everything changes. Nothing can provide lasting satisfaction, and there's no fixed, permanent essence that we can call me or mine. Ambapali's verses are a direct demonstration of these truths, using her own body as the teaching tool. What she was offering in these verses was not just an account of her own aging, but a practice that anyone could use. Look clearly at the body, she was saying. Don't look away from the changes. Don't pretend they're not happening, but also don't make them mean more than they do. They're just changes, just the nature of physical form playing itself out according to natural law. When she said, "Not otherwise is the word of the truthful one," after each observation, she was pointing to a profound trust in the teachings. The Buddha had said the body would age and decay, that all conditioned things are impermanent, that clinging to them brings suffering. And now she was seeing this truth manifested in her own flesh, confirming through direct experience what she had been taught. There's a deep peace in this kind of seeing. When you stop fighting against the nature of things, when you stop demanding that your body remain young, or that circumstances stay the same, when you simply observe what is actually happening without all the mental elaboration, something relaxes. The suffering that comes from resistance dissolves, and what remains is a clear awareness that doesn't depend on the body's condition. Ambapali had discovered that she was not diminished by her body's aging. Her wisdom, her peace, her fundamental freedom, none of these had anything to do with whether her hair was black or grey, whether her skin was smooth or wrinkled, whether her body was desired or ignored. These qualities arose from understanding, from clear seeing, from the liberation that comes when grasping finally ceases. In fact, you could say that Ambapali was more beautiful in old age than she had ever been in youth, though it was a beauty of an entirely different order. The beauty of youth is the beauty of a flower in bloom, lovely, certainly, but temporary and dependent on conditions. The beauty Ambapali manifested in her later years was the beauty of wisdom, of freedom, of a heart that had learned to release its grip on everything that passes. Her verses show us that aging doesn't have to be a slow tragedy of loss. It can instead be a deepening understanding, a continuous reminder of truths we need to learn, a gradual stripping away of everything superficial until only what's essential remains. The body changes, this is guaranteed, but the awareness that knows the body, the consciousness that observes the changes, this can grow clearer and more stable even as the body weakens. What Ambapali was teaching through her example is that we don't have to wait until we're old to practice this kind of clear seeing. Every day, the body is changing in small ways. We can learn to notice these changes without the usual layer of judgment and story. The grey hair that appears, the line that forms, the energy that isn't quite what it was. These can all be moments of practice, opportunities to observe impermanence directly and to let go a little more of our identification with this temporary form. Amberpali spent the first decades of her life believing she was her beauty, and that belief brought her both pleasure and pain. She spent the middle decades of her life learning to see through that belief, discovering a freedom that didn't depend on physical appearance. And she spent her final years demonstrating that freedom through her verses, using the very body that was decaying as proof of the teachings that had liberated her. In the end, Amberpali's story is not really about aging at all. It's about awakening. It's about how suffering arises from grasping at what cannot be held, and how freedom comes from seeing clearly the impermanent nature of all things. Her body was her classroom, and the lessons she learned there, she offered freely to anyone who would listen. The courtesan who had once been prized for her physical beauty became a teacher whose wisdom continues to illuminate the path 25 centuries later. Her hair grayed, her eyes dimmed, her body bent and weakened, and through it all, she remained free, observing each change with clarity and confirming with each observation that the truth she had been taught was indeed the truth she was living. Not otherwise is the word of the truthful one. In 8th century China, there lived a man named Pang who might have been wealthy and comfortable if he had wanted to be. He had been born into a good family, had received an education, and possessed the skills and connections to make his way in the world. But somewhere along the way, Pang encountered the teachings of Zen Buddhism, and that encounter changed everything about how he understood life, how he wanted to spend his time, and what actually mattered. Instead of pursuing wealth and status, Pang loaded all his possessions and money onto a boat, rowed out to the middle of a river, and sank the entire cargo. When people asked why he didn't at least give the money away to help others, he replied that possessions only complicate life, and he didn't want to complicate anyone else's life either. This was the kind of person Pang was, someone who had seen through the usual motivations so completely that his actions seemed almost absurd to those still caught in conventional thinking. What made Pang's story even more unusual was that his entire family shared his realization. His wife, whose name is lost to history, practiced with the same depth and clarity as her husband. Their son and their daughter, Ling Zhao, both grew up immersed in the Dharma, not as a set of beliefs to memorize, but as a living reality to embody moment by moment. The family would travel together through China, supporting themselves by making and selling simple bamboo utensils, engaging in Dharma discussions wherever they went, and living with a lightness and humor that comes only from genuine freedom. By the time Pang reached old age, the family had settled in a cave on Mount Deer Gate. They owned almost nothing, needed almost nothing, and yet somehow lacked nothing. Their days were simple. Some work, some meditation, some conversation, some silence. They lived so seamlessly with the natural flow of things that there was no sense of effort or striving, just a continuous presence with whatever the moment brought. One morning, Pang woke up and knew something with absolute certainty. It was time for him to die. This wasn't a guess or a worry or a fear. It was simply clear information arising from deep awareness of his body and its cycles. He didn't resist this knowledge, didn't try to bargain with it, didn't fall into anxiety about what it meant. He observed it the same way he might observe the sun rising or the seasons changing, as a natural occurrence, requiring no commentary. He told his daughter Ling Zhao that he planned to die at noon. She didn't cry or protest or try to talk him out of it. Instead, she asked him to let her know when the sun reached its highest point, so she could be there with him. This was the kind of family they were. Death was not a taboo subject, not something to be feared and avoided, but simply another transition to be met with awareness and presence. As noon approached, Pang sat down in meditation posture, settled his mind, and prepared to let go of this life with the same ease with which he had let go of everything else. He had lived fully, practiced deeply, and now it was time for this particular expression of consciousness to dissolve back into the larger movement of life and death that encompasses all things. But just as he was settling into his final meditation, his daughter Ling Zhao suddenly called out from outside the cave, "Father, Father, come quickly. There's a solar eclipse. You must see this." Now, Pang was a man who had dedicated his life to seeing clearly, to being present with reality as it actually is. And a solar eclipse is indeed a rare and remarkable occurrence, a moment when the ordinary patterns of sun and moon align in unexpected ways. So despite being moments away from his planned death, Pang got up from his meditation seat and went to look. When he stepped outside, there was no eclipse. The sun shone, as it always did at noon, bright and unobscured. Pang turned back toward the cave, perhaps to question his daughter about her announcement, but then he stopped. Inside the cave, in the exact spot where he had been sitting, his daughter Ling Zhao had taken